Welcome back to BetterHelp's In Session series. I'm Hesu Joe, a licensed therapist and part of the clinical operations team here at BetterHelp. Today, I'm super excited to be joined again by Dr. Mariel Buqué, who's an Afro-Dominican Columbia University-trained psychologist, intergenerational trauma expert, and the author of the book Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. Her clinical framework is holistic and infuses ancient and indigenous healing practices into a modern, comprehensive therapeutic approach. She has utilized her training in holistic care to integrate holistic practices like sound bath meditation and breath work into therapy, which has helped to deepen trauma healing for her clients. Dr. Mariel, thank you so much for being back on our show. It's been quite a while since you and I had a chance to talk. In fact, I think the last time we spoke was very much back and deep in the COVID times.
Yeah.
So how have you been? How have things been?
Thank you for having me back. I have been well. I have been busy, as you might imagine, and as many of us clinicians have been during these trying times. And as we, surfaced out of the pandemic and really, tried to kind of establish our normalcy back. But it's been a wonderful journey on a professional end, just really getting the healing protocol that I developed out into the world through my book. So it's been wonderful to finally be able to talk about it publicly.
It's great, and congratulations. I'm really eager to get a conversation started about this, and excited myself to probably get my hands on the book and read it too.
Yeah.
Because that's what we want to get into today is this book. Again, new book out there, Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. And it sounds like it's something that you've probably been working on for a long time, even when or before you set the intention of writing the book. I imagine it's something you've been working on for a long time. So how did this book come about?
Well, interestingly enough, the book, it did burgeon out of a season that definitely was before I even conceptualized that I would even write a book. And it came out of more specifically me being in my clinic team meetings and just continuing to hear the same stories come up between myself and my fellow clinicians as we would go through like grand rounds or as we would talk about some of the cases that we needed some clinical input in. And I kept hearing the same story of, well, my patient had or my client had this happen in their lives, and so did their mother, and so did their grandmother. And so it just continued to be the same story being replicated time and again, week after week, just in different clients. And no one was really naming the fact that what we were, in essence, seeing in all of these experiences with clients, the clinical material was intergenerational trauma, but no one actually had the language, the protocol to really understand what it was that we were all collectively seeing, and then actually institute protocols to help our clients through those very ailments that they were coming in with that had, this similar like layered experience.
And this theme of intergenerational trauma, I think it's actually something you and I talked about in our last conversation. So even though I didn't know you were working on this book at the time, this is something that I know that you have seen present in your work, in your clients. And so I can guess that there's some personal stuff sprinkled into the knowledge that you've brought out now to bring healing, to help clients find that for themselves. And so when it comes to themes in this book, I'm going to guess there's some personal things, but I don't want to assume that. So I'd love to hear from you about themes in the book and how that might be tied to your own personal experience even.
Yeah, there definitely is a personal angle that's in there. My family was so gracious as to allow me to intersperse our stories within the book as well. In addition to the stories that I've been honored to hear from my own therapy room in the work that I've done with clients. So the book does have, I guess you can call it a part memoir, kind of like interspersed within the pages of the book, because my story, my family story, and my patient stories are all in there. And then it also operates as a healing guide and has a healing protocol for people who wish to do the healing for themselves, the cycle breakers of the world that wish to break the cycle, but also for us clinicians who haven't had a roadmap as to how we can actually create healing inside of our therapy rooms, our healing spaces for the individuals that are coming in with these layered histories. But I didn't think that the book would be complete without me adding some of the vulnerable points that I have had to also dig into for myself in order to experience the healing myself. I am a therapist that very much subscribes to especially all of the multicultural competencies, but one of them is the competency of awareness, right? And like that self-awareness, that self-introspection, that bringing the knowledge that we attain as clinicians back into our own lives, and the holding ourselves accountable for being vulnerable, for doing vulnerable work. All of that is a part of the journey that I have integrated into my clinical spaces just globally. And so it definitely came to life with intergenerational trauma healing work. And so I thought it would be an opportunity to really showcase my very humanness also in the book. And so it definitely is reflected within there. And I think that it as us clinicians are trained to do, it operates to serve the people that are reading it to be able to see how healing can take place, even for a clinician.
I got to extend that thanks to you and your family too, because what I think you're describing is just like being very vulnerable, putting a lot of all of this stuff on the inside for you very personally and deeply with your family too out there, so somebody can learn from it, so somebody can feel like they're not so isolated in it. Because I imagine plenty of clinicians before us have had these transformative experiences and for whatever reason didn't get around to writing a book about it, and bearing their soul in that process. So I'm very, very thankful to you, for doing that and bringing some of this personal knowledge and the things that you've collected from your clientele together. So my understanding is that, in this book, you're going into some personal things, talking about clientele, bringing up education that you've been able to create from all the work that you've done. And in there's some kind of piece or chapter, I don't know, about the connection between somatic symptoms, so things that are happening in our body, things that we might be experiencing, feeling, and the connection with our psychological mind, the stuff that's in our psyche. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book actually operates as a holistic healing guide. So it has interspersed within it different practices that help us in extracting some of these layers of trauma from the mind, extracting them from the body, as we know that the body captures a lot of our stress, tension, and trauma pockets are deposited into the body whenever we experience these very unraveling events in our lives. And the same goes for the spirit dimension. So I do, the work in a very mind, body, spirit kind of layered, multidimensional healing framework. And the spirit dimension for me, as I see it within the work and as I reflect it even in my own clinical practices, well, how connected do you feel to yourself or to others? Because one dimension of what gets fractured when we experience trauma is our relationships. And that can mean relationships to human beings, relationships to higher powers, relationship to ourselves and our core selves and like who we truly are. The dissociative aspect of trauma disconnects us from every one of the dimensions of our relationships that we hold in life. So I aim to integrate the person back into that element of who they are at their core selves and how they can more profoundly connect to the individuals and to anything that is in their lives, to the universe, universal elements, to anything that helps them to feel grounded. So the mind, body, spirit connection is very much a key element of how we do holistic healing work. And my premise for doing holistic healing work when it comes to intergenerational trauma healing is because, as I have seen it, whenever we focus just on the mind, for example, we're able to talk about, well, who hurt you, what happened, and all of these things. We are able to do some version of healing, but people still carry a lot within their bodies, or their relationships still operate in a way where they're still fracturing. And so if we only focus on one dimension of what has happened and leave the other two dimensions to still carry the pain, we've only done a portion of the work. And so my aim was to provide full healing to the individual that is undergoing this kind of multi-generational dilemma, and to offer them as many tools within all of these dimensions as I possibly could so that they could continue that process well into their generation, but even so that it can have an impact for generations to come.
Wow. I'm sitting here hearing you thinking like, there's a lot in there, but the book I see behind you is not like 1,000 pages. So I imagine you've
Yeah.
neatly packaged some of these things.
Yeah.
And this is now my curiosity. It sounds like when you were writing, your audience, your intended audience is just people.
Mhm.
Maybe some pieces for clinicians, maybe some pieces for folks that are looking to break cycles, address their own mental health and overall wellness. Did you have a specific audience in mind when you were writing? Like, is this for therapists or for clients, or what would you say?
Yeah, I was very intentional about making sure that the pages reflected tools that could be utilized for both. So it's it starts off, every single chapter starts off with education. So psychoeducation, if you may, about the different elements of intergenerational trauma. And that way, either a person that is hoping to learn what intergenerational trauma is and how it appears in their lives
Mhm.
can actually internalize that knowledge, or a clinician can actually learn these pieces and then relay it in a psychoeducative way to their clients so that they can then do the healing work from a place that feels not only educative but also grounding, so it has both elements within the work itself. So my aim was to do that. Now, I did start off the book with writing it with a very heavy research emphasis. So
Mm.
it felt, even, which is, has been my traditional writing style, before actually writing a book that was, supposed to be for a larger audience. I would write journal articles within like peer reviewed journals. So it had a very research heavy tone to it.
Mhm.
And this actually doesn't. And the reason being is because I wanted to make it as accessible as it could possibly be. And it needed to not be a book that reflected, let's say, like my ego, like I know things, right? But more so reflected the desire that I have for everyone to know these things. And so it needed to be as accessible in the language, which is, the research is there and it is prominent throughout the entire book, but it doesn't read like a research book. It reads like a book where people can obtain the knowledge that is reflected in research materials, but that they could obtain it in order to integrate it into their daily lives, have conversations with their fellow cycle breakers, people either in their families, colleagues, friends, anyone who is in their community, and have these conversations in a way where everyone can understand what is truly happening to us when we're not breaking these cycles, and we're transferring this information by way of cultural values that are unhealthy, by way of systemic inequities that continue to perpetuate trauma, by way of unhealthy relational patterns that we're engaging in with one another, and that people can actually take that information and produce it at a larger scale by way of having these conversations with other people, and that we can then collectively create a generation of cycle breakers, because everyone will have some version of access to that information, either by way of hearing it from someone else or reading it through the book.
I love that. I mean, this comment you're making of wanting to make it accessible, I think that's so important because I mean, of course, a lot of the literature that exists out there, the stuff that's being pumped out of folks that are doing these studies and, you know, very much in a clinical setting with a controlled study, they want to communicate their findings. But those findings, like you said, are not always accessible to people because of the way it's written. That kind of language is really dense for those that don't go to school to read that. And even people that go to school, I'm including
Yeah.
myself in this. Some of those
Yeah.
studies are very difficult for me to interpret in a way that makes sense to real life application. So I'm very appreciative for
Mhm.
practitioners out there that are writing books for people and not just PhD students. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's so important because the themes that you're covering are not just things that should live in the vacuum of research, right? It's the stuff that's going to heal all of us for us to connect with, like you said, the things that are impacting our relationships with self, with others, with the
Mhm.
ecosystems around us. And you
Yeah.
mentioned that a lot of what interferes from us being able to function and perform in the ways that we want to stems from trauma, if not intergenerational trauma. And you mentioned the word dissociate a couple of times. And just realizing it could be very helpful for folks that are not super familiar with what that is even. People may hear dissociate and think of some stuff we see in the media, like does that mean they have multiple personalities or things like that? So I was just wondering if you could share a bit more about how trauma manifests specifically in this way of dissociation, and maybe like a little sneak peek into what someone might find in the book of how to address this manifestation of trauma.
Love the question. When we experience an event that actually taps out our capacities to feel like we are safe, when we feel like our personhood has been threatened in some way, our safety has been threatened, or some element of who we are in that moment feels threatened, then what tends to happen is that we start developing coping mechanisms to get through the moment. And eventually, for some of us, whenever we feel overwhelmed by the circumstance or set of circumstances that we've appraised as a traumatic event, there is a likelihood that we could remain stuck or frozen in certain nervous system responses, which some of us have heard out there are like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which are basically like our nervous system stuck in a threat response. When that happens, there is a likely chance that whenever we see anything in our environment or experience anything in our environment or experience an emotion internally that reminds us of the event, that we will get back into trying to self-protect. And that self-protection can sometimes look like what we call dissociation. And dissociation is basically us mentally distancing ourselves from our current environment because it does not feel safe, because there is what we call a trigger in the environment or a remembrance in the environment, something that's reminding us of when we did not feel safe. And so, we as humans, we dissociate all the time naturally. It just is something that the mind is programmed to do. However, when we do it because we perceive a threat and a threat is not necessarily present anymore, that is when we have to start thinking about the ways that we can remedy that. And so within the book itself, some of the ways that I help us remedy the dissociative aspect of being in a state of trauma is by way of some of the holistic practices that I integrate even into my own practice, which are like sound bath meditations, which are incorporated into the book itself. And there's some sound healing that I actually have as actual accompanied audio for the book. There are also a host of different meditations that I either bring in some element of ancestral imagery for us to actually picture individuals that wish us well and keep us in their thoughts and love, like perhaps a grandmother that was deeply loving and cared for us, but is no longer here with us. But our capacity to just imagine or remember her words, her voice, the feeling of her embrace, and things that bring us back into a state of safety can be very helpful for someone who is presently feeling unsafe in their own body. And there are a host of other different holistic practices that I either integrate into practices that are also mind-based or that are standalone practices that are simply there to bring the body into feeling safe again. So within the book, I integrate a lot of what is a part of intergenerational trauma and has been maybe popularized in our language out into the world, but we haven't really brought it into intergenerational trauma work just yet. Yet it is there. It is a part of it. Like, for example, childhood traumas. We talk about inner child healing or inner child traumas frequently now in the world, but not so much when it comes to intergenerational trauma and the possibility that we have inner child wounds, but our parents also do, and so did our grandparents. And what did their inner child wounds manifest into as they were caring for us? And how did they potentially fall short in their care because they themselves were carrying wounds? And how can we heal the wounds that we now carry that are so layered because They are a reflection of not only the wounds that we had to experience in our own childhood and the inner child that then became programmed in us, but how can we also heal the layers of that, which means that we're healing also the layers of inner child wounding in our parents and grandparents and so forth. And so there is, the elements in the book definitely have layers through and through. So every single chapter is layered, every single healing protocol and process and practice is layered. And so it's really peeling back the layers so that we can feel a lot lighter once we're done with the healing process. And it's an ongoing journey, just as is anything that's mental health related. But at least we can, uncover some of those layers and pull back, some of what's already been there and shed some of the weight that we've been carrying around for so many generations.
I'm already feeling a little bit lighter from what it sounds like one can learn quite a lot of in this book. And you mentioned, thinking of like the imagery of your grandmother's voice, and you're mentioning things like ancestry or ancestors, ancestral trauma. And I can guess that some people out there, when they hear ancestor, they're thinking like, 10 generations back or something like that. Or they hear ancestral trauma and have no idea what that means. And you've already touched on quite a lot of what this might mean. But for folks out there that really are new to this term, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about how we can come to understand, like, what are you talking about, or what are people talking about when they say ancestral trauma? Do I really care when I'm about to give a speech, like what happened to my great 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 grandfather? Is that what you're talking about? Or like, would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, most of what I start doing with folks is I start building out what I call an intergenerational trauma tree. And within that tree, there is a reflection of as many histories as we're able to capture or are present or that we know about in the family line. Usually it goes about 2 to 3 generations down, and people don't have a lot of history or data points beyond that. However, the information that we're able to capture, some of which is the most important, is what kind of trauma responses were present in each of those individuals that we're accounting a history for. And to take, for example, like people pleasing qualities. There could be a parent that was a people pleaser and they modeled how to people please to their child, right? And so we're accounting for the fact that modeling is a part of how intergenerational trauma or trauma responses are modeled, are integrated into the next generation. And so we're putting that in the intergenerational tree. And we're following down the line, like who else was people pleasing, or who else was maybe, had a controlling quality, and that led to the other person people pleasing. And so we're just like mapping down the family line, the different kinds of trauma responses, personality characteristics, the different actual traumatic events. Sometimes, for an individual who is a descendant of Holocaust survivors, like perhaps we have the Holocaust reflected within the family tree as one pervasively traumatic event that had a way in which people then survived by way of having like certain like trauma responses represented in 2 generations down the line, right? And so like we want to get a sense of where did some of these trauma responses originate, who were the people that reflected these trauma responses, and how did it then start integrating within my own life, and beyond that, then how do we start the extracting? Because a lot of people, when they come to me or when I speak to people in a public forum, typically I get the question of, well, how do I know what the trauma responses are? And it can be very helpful to just take ourselves out of our own lifetime and start looking at all of the people around us and the ways that they manage stress or didn't manage stress. And that's the starting point of where we're starting to see, okay, well, if, my uncle felt like whenever he felt like he had abundant stress in his life, he would get into this explosive rage. And that was always felt by every family member because he would come around with so much irritability and everyone would feel it, right? And so that created a lot of tension and unhealthy family patterns in the family. then we need some of that history and to understand, well, how did that then translate into how my mother then internalized her stress, and then how she modeled stress internalization to me. So there's a lot of those histories that are going to be really critical in us being able to know the common threads. And then from there, when people have that level of enlightenment, they can start looking at their lives in the very ways that we do with other kinds of, challenges that people face that are mental health related. Like when people can say, oh, the anxiety that I have is social anxiety. It's situated in social environments. Now I can actually start approaching social environments with a strategy, because that's where, my challenges are held. I'm not anxious whenever I have to approach a test. I'm anxious when I have to approach friends, right? And so like that way we can already have that history integrated into what we're going to do thereafter.
I'm hearing that part of healing, especially when it comes to intergenerational trauma and breaking any cycle, and maybe you get into this in the book. Again, letting people know I haven't read this, but as I'm hearing, I'm thinking like in order to heal, one must hold space. Maybe must is strong a word here, but it sounds like there's a lot of space to be held for what happened to our parents, what happened to their parents. Because I've had plenty of clients that have such a difficult time thinking that they can ever get to the point that they can forgive what happened to them from parents or grandparents, even, or what happened to their parents. There's this idea of forgiveness and being able to move forward and move on, whatever that looks like for people. So even if it's not in the book, would love to hear your thoughts. Like, what would you say to someone that's saying, but Dr. Mariel, I hear you. You're saying that I need to identify this and reintegrate that, but I'm still really mad at my mom for the way that she X, Y, and Z. I'm starting to realize now in my work with you that she herself was abused in this way. And maybe that came out in the way that she treated me or raised me. But what do I do with that feeling of resentment for generations past? How can I break the cycle if I'm still so mad about them perpetuating that cycle?
Mm-hmm. That's actually one of the most common things that cycle breakers experience. It's the very righteous and valid rage towards the individuals that did not break the cycle prior to them and cause them harm as a result, either willingly or unknowingly, they caused harm. And so now they have to then extract all of these wounds and do double the work because the people that came before them didn't do it. And so we actually hold even more space for all of the emotions that actually come with holding that grief of what hasn't happened, which is that the cycle was not broken prior to. There isn't within the book and within my work, I don't actually ask cycle breakers to offer forgiveness or to engage in the process of building compassion for anybody who came before them or anybody who caused them harm, because that is a very personal decision that people would have to make outside of this work if they wish to do that. And it also is an unfair ask of anybody who has been injured in this very profound way. Instead, what I offer is an opportunity for data collection, an opportunity to get to know ourselves better by way of understanding the full landscape of what happened around us. And so that's why there is this intergenerational trauma tree. There is an assessment that really collects the data so that we can have a full scope of all of the things that happened and hold space for all of the ways in which those moving pieces all came together to then create the hurt that we're now experiencing. However, there isn't a moment within the work itself where there's any sort of ask of a cycle breaker to then take that information to forgive or take that information to hold any level of compassion. Some people do, but that's just because that's what naturally burgeons out of them. And some people don't. Some people decide that because they now have this data, that what they wish to do is to create an emotional barrier between themselves and the individuals that cause them pain. And that's the method of their healing, and that's what's going to cause them to shed the weight. And so that tends to be so much more of an individual process that I didn't integrate it into the book because I wanted to honor the journey that everyone walks individually.
Love that. And I really hope that that's a message that a ton of people will hear. Because I think like even therapists are going to think when they hear about this book that there's going to be some section about how to help your clients with these very difficult feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, we heard it here. We heard it from the expert here that part isn't necessary, right? It's not that we must forgive someone in order to feel better. It's a lot more complicated than that, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate that take. And I really, really would love for everybody that's going through something like this, some kind of feeling of, just upset towards somebody about something that's happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you may feel like it's impossible to forgive, but we're hearing now from Dr. Mariel that may not actually be required for you to find healing in your own journey. In this kind of work, we also hear a buzzword quite a lot called collective healing. We have like our individual selves or collective societies and even collective thinking. And I'm hearing from what we're talking about now that there is an importance of this concept of collective healing. So I'd love to hear from you about what that even means.
Yeah, well, we have collective wounds that sometimes we amass by way of being within groups that have experienced a collective trauma, as we call them, right? And so some collective healing can be the healing that a collective of group can experience. And there can be smaller versions of collective healing that can look different, which can all just happen between two individuals. Within the book, I actually do invite people to, should they wish to do collective healing work, to gather a fellow cycle breaker, like a best friend or someone who is, a community member, or it could even be a sibling, like anybody who isn't someone who has directly caused them any kind of injury or pain, but someone who they believe is equally committed to do the healing and excavating work, and that should they wish to do this work collectively with someone, that they could, right? Because it is heavy work. And so sometimes we do need someone that we can, just rely upon for when the work gets heavy. Of course, the work can also be done with a trained professional, with a clinician, right? And so that can be a place where a person can have a sounding board, but also can really workshop through some of the different techniques and the different layers of what comes up. But if people are willing to do some of this work with somebody who they wish to do the work with, then they can. I, for example, in my own personal life, I have done separate versions of this breaking the cycle process with my sister, with my best friend, and with a mentor. In addition to also the multitude of different healers that I've actually connected with, sound bath meditation healers, with clinicians, with all different kinds of healers. And there have been different people with whom I've been able to practice and collectively heal. And so there is opportunity there for people to then integrate other individuals into their journey. And the healing can hold a lot of like depth whenever we do the work with others, and can actually engage in the practices in a way where we can feel seen and heard and validated by another individual. And they can also be very depth related and very, very profoundly liberating when we do the work ourselves, and we can feel the pride of having done that. So I invite cycle breakers to choose the path that they feel it resonates the most with them, so that there's agency and choice in being able to do that. But I offer variations of the different tools in ways that they can be integrated into either a collective healing format or a format that's more individually based.
I did have a question to circle back to something you've mentioned a few times, and now I'm realizing some people might not know what this is. So can you share about what is sound bath healing or sound bath meditation? Like, I think some people that have maybe been to yoga are familiar with some of the instruments that some of the yoga instructors might bring. And that's my guess as to what some of this might be, but I'd love to hear more. Like, yeah, what is sound bath meditation?
Yes. So Actually, sound healing itself has been used for a multitude of generations, centuries, by a number of different cultures in order to create a healing path for the body and sometimes even the mind. However, sound bath meditations themselves have Tibetan roots in Buddhist practice and have originated in that part of the world. Um, and the actual instrument, the mechanism of healing is through an actual bowl, which used to be only a brass bowl, but has also transformed into also being crystal sound bowls that emit specific sound frequencies that are known to actually recalibrate the body through micro vibrations that the frequencies emit and help us to enter a relaxation state. And so, because of its capacity to create an almost immediate effect upon a person's mind and body, but also to do so in a more long-standing way, I thought it would be a really critical instrument and practice to integrate into something that requires so much immediate effect of helping us to feel safe and relaxed in our own bodies in the moment of doing the work, but also for the sustainability and longevity of doing healing work like intergenerational trauma healing.
There's there's so much to be learned from our ancestors, from healing practices that generations have used. And now I'm kind of thinking about like, well, we lost a lot of that stuff somehow in the US. We don't focus a lot on things that are not considered like Western medicine. So I'm really glad and excited to read more about this and to see that it's being integrated into the work that we do as therapists, because plenty of people out there will say like, well, therapy is not an exact science. So if that's the case, I don't think we need to be keeping therapy so sterile and clinical. So I love the holistic work. I hope folks out there are eager to get their hands on this book too, to start breaking cycles themselves. So where can folks get this book and also learn more about you?
Oh, well, people can go to my website, drmarielbuqué.com, and there I also have the book listed, and also on social media. I'm at dr.marielbuqué on all the platforms, and I have links to all of the work that I'm doing, but also to the book and all of those platforms as well.
Thank you. And we'll link all that so folks can find you, find the book, and get into it. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.